name's Katie. Welcome to my channel, Duckpotatoe's World. And today, I'm going to do an unboxing video because I have got my Hot Springs Fiber Company Blanket of Knowledge subscription box in the mail. So I'm really excited to open it up and see what I've got inside and talk about my blanket. Sorry, apparently I should have grabbed a knife. I had some scissors, but they don't want to work. There we go. All right, so I have not looked at this yet. So I have the Enchanted colorway. It's so beautiful. There it is. Oh my goodness, it's so gorgeous. So, in my box, I have my Hot Springs Fiber Company Blanket of Knowledge Yarn of the Month, my Mini Skein, which is going to be black. So the Mini Skein will be the same color every month, but the main color will be different every month. I have stitch markers, which are super cute. I have, oh my gosh, my son's gonna be so excited because these are not my favorite candy, but he loves them. I have treats, they're Twizzlers. I have tea. And I have a pair of Chai-Gu needles. These are size, they're 6s and they're a 47-inch cable. So, well, actually mine are 5s, but most people will get 6s. I have a kind of a loose gauge and I asked for a size down. But the needles that will be used to complete my project. And of course I have the pattern. So I am so excited. Now, if you have been watching my channel, you know that I actually have 2 Blanket of Knowledge blankets that I'm working on. The first one is in the colorway Cabin in the Woods, and that one I'm doing the block construction with. But this one, the Enchanted, I'm going to do the strip construction. And so I'm going to go wind up this yarn, and then we're going to have a little visit about gauge. Okay, let's talk about gauge. So every person you ask about gauge is going to have a different opinion and a different story to tell you. For some people, they knit gauge swatches and they come out beautifully every time. Some people never knit gauge swatches and their product is the perfect size every time. And then there are people like me who always knit beautiful gauge swatches and still find them to be tiny little liars that lie. No matter what of those 3 or anything in between that you may fall under, gauge swatches really are still important because they give you a lot of useful information about your project. Besides the anticipated size of your project, they also tell you how the yarn and fabric are going to behave, what your stitches are going to look like in the size needle that you're using, and they give you just a place to begin. So even if you're like me and you find that your swatches tend to be tiny little liars that lie, they still give me a starting point, whereas if I didn't knit a gauge swatch at all, I would have no idea where to begin. So I will probably be knitting a gauge swatch in stockinette, which is what the pattern recommends. And then we'll look at the gauge swatch and we'll get some information off of it that will help us decide how many stitches I want to cast on for my strip blanket construction. So I'm going to go knit the gauge swatch and I'll come back when I have it to show you. Okay, we have caked up our yarn and I have already knit my gauge swatch. Now, I knit different size gauge swatches for different projects, and for me, usually I find that the larger the gauge swatch I knit, the more accurate it does tend to be. But since this is a blanket and not a garment that needs to fit me, I didn't feel like a huge gauge swatch was necessary. So I cast on 30 stitches and I knit a total of 37 rows. Now stockinette curls, so I did the first 2 rows and the last 2 rows in garter stitch, and I gave myself a garter stitch edge just to help it lie flat. And you can see I have a running stitch marker. That's this brown yarn coming in and out here. That's marking off every 5 rows for the middle of my swatch. And what I'm going to use that to do is to make really easy, accurate measurements. You could just knit the whole thing in stockinette and then measure the whole entire swatch. I don't find that that's as accurate as this method. I've also already washed and blocked my swatch. And I washed it and blocked it the way I plan to wash and block my blanket, which is I just soaked it in water and spun it out in my washing machine and laid it flat to dry. Because that's all I'm ever going to do with the blanket. When I'm making a swatch for a sweater, I wash it and dry it the way I plan to wash and dry the sweater. So once you have done the gauge swatch, you're going to need to measure it. Now, like I said, I used these running stitch markers to mark off kind of the center of my swatch where all my stitches are nice and even. A running stitch marker, if you don't already know, is just a random piece of yarn that you weave in and out between stitches every so many rows. I happen to do mine every 5 rows. You could do it every 4 rows or every 10 rows or whatever works for you. I did it every 5 rows. And what I like about a running stitch marker is it gives me really clear place to measure, because I just measure from one to the other point in, you know, in the yarn. So which is right at 4 inches for me, and I can measure in multiple places and I'm getting 4 inches. So I'm getting exactly 20 stitches in 4 inches. So I'm going to make a note of that. You can see here, I'm going to write down how many I cast on, how many rows I knit, and then how many I'm actually measuring, because I'm only measuring these 20 stitches in the middle, and there are 20 stitches and 25 rows. So I have 4 inches and 20 stitches, and I'm going to measure my rows. So I have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 rows in my gauge swatch, and I'm going to measure with my little ruler here, and I got 3.5 on this side. We'll measure 3, and let's see, 3 3/8 is what it's looking like there. So I'll measure this again. Oh, about 3 3/8 is probably about right. So I have 3 3/8 of an inch in 25 rows. From this point, I can take this information and I can figure out what I'm getting in terms of stitches per inch. So 3/8 of an inch is the equivalent of 3.375 inches in 25 rows. That's going to be a little easier to work with, so we'll go with that. And I am not as concerned with my row gauge for this project. This is a blanket. I can participate in the blanket of knowledge for as long as I want, so I can keep going until my blanket is square or the rectangle depth of my choice. I can choose when to stop, so I'm not as concerned about this measurement. But this measurement, my stitch gauge, that I am a little more curious about, because this is what's going to help me know what size blanket, how many stitches to cast on for the size blanket that I want. So this is a really nice easy gauge, because 20 stitches in 4 inches is 5 stitches per inch. 5 stitches per inch. Now all I have to do is look at the cast on numbers for the different sizes and decide what size I want and what cast on I want. And I know for the blanket of knowledge, she recommends that you cast on in a multiple of 10. So I just get to pick how big blanket I want, pick a multiple of 10 that's going to get me that size, and then I'll be happy. So you can use the chart that comes with your pattern. You should have gotten a PDF with kind of some gauge instructions in it to kind of give you a guideline about what size you want to use. I am going to probably do a twin size, maybe a throw size. I don't think I want to do a full size blanket. So I can kind of gauge how many stitches I want to cast on based on that. So this is really easy. And once you've decided, you know, whatever size blanket you want, let's just say I've decided I want a twin size blanket, which would be about 66 inches. I would set up my gauge information like this, and I want to do 90 inches, or excuse me, 66 inches.
So that would go here, and you're just going to work a proportion where you cross multiply and divide. So I'm going to multiply 66 times 20. That's 1,320, which I'm then going to divide by 4, which is 330. So for a twin size blanket, I may want to cast on, for my gauge, 330 stitches. If I wanted to do a full size, I would do the same thing. I would just put in the 90 inches that are needed for a full size blanket. I'd multiply 90 times 20, which is 1,800. I would divide that by 4. I would want to cast on 450 stitches. So this would be a twin, this would be a full. You could work this out for yourself for every size. Let's say I want to do a throw size. That would be 53 inches. So it would be 53 times 20, which is 1,060 divided by 4, which would give me a cast on of 265. And actually that might be what I do, because I don't really want to cast on 330. Plus, remember I've told you that for some people, your gauge swatch may be a tiny little liar that lies. And that happens to me a lot. I tend to knit much larger in my actual project than I do on a small swatch. So the chances of me having it come out a little bit bigger are pretty high. So I may even decide I want to do something in between here. Maybe I'll just cast on 300 stitches and kind of call it good. It's your blanket. You can make it as big or as small as you want. Now from here, once I've decided how much I'm going to cast on, you might notice I did not cut my yarn here. You can see it's still attached. And the reason for that is that I want to use as much of this yarn as I possibly can in my blanket. So once I've got my cast on, I will weigh my yarn before I begin. I'll cast on and weigh my yarn again. I'll knit section 1 and weigh my yarn again. I'll knit section 2 and weigh my yarn again. And I'm going to keep track about how much yarn I'm using so that I know if I can repeat section 1 a second time or not, or if I need to make any other adjustments in the number of rows that I'm knitting based on how much yarn it's taking me to knit a row. And I can do the same kind of thing with my mini skein. So when I get done with knitting the main part of my blanket, I can weigh my mini skein and do my rows of seed stitch and then weigh them so I know about how many grams I'm using up for every row, and then that will tell me how many rows of seed stitch I can get out of my 20 grams. And of course, if you're using a larger blanket, then you're going to do fewer rows because it's going to use up more, there's going to be more stitches using up yarn. So hopefully that kind of helped you through the process of determining what number of stitches you want to cast on based on your personal gauge and the size blanket that you want to make. Thank you so much for watching.